Hello, great to see you. I am actually re-recording this class that I taught on Sunday, December 4th, because I forgot to press record. So this is a special online version of week 2 of reading the Bible. I'll walk through what I taught on Sunday morning and be a little shorter, but hopefully as meaningful to you as it was to the folks in the class. So let's begin. I always will start these classes off with a bit of Bible trivia in a sense to give you something to chew on. 3 little fun Bible facts today. In 1525, William Tyndale first translated the New Testament from Greek into English. And when he did so, he introduced a bunch of new words into the English language. From his translation come the words long-suffering, peacemaker, scapegoat, and the word beautiful. Second fun trivia fact, the cost of a Bible in the 1300s was equivalent to a priest's entire yearly income. And last but not least, the Bible chapter divisions were created in the early 1200s by a lecturer at the University of Paris. The Bible's current verse divisions were not fully developed until 1551. All right, so last week, let's do a quick review we talked about last week for those who were here and those who weren't. 4 key points I want to illustrate from last week. First, Mosaic, not Moses. What this means is that the Old Testament was compiled, the Hebrew Bible was compiled, not by one author. The Torah was often considered to be compiled by Moses, written by Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now we know that the first 5 books and the entire Old Testament is a compilation, a mosaic of different authors and sources, not one source. 15,000. Took roughly 50 years for all the current writings we have in the New Testament to be written. It took about 1,000 years for all the writings that now make up the Old Testament to be written. So condensed period of history for the New Testament, expansive range of history for the Old. Books got into the Bible basically on 3 principles. One, were they related to the characters in the story or the writers of the text. So the Gospels are a great example of this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were all connected with one of the early apostles, and so they were seen as valid contributions to the holy texts. Same with Paul's letters. They were related to Paul, who had a firsthand encounter, and so they were included. So most of the books that are in the scriptures are related to somebody important, especially in the New Testament. Reading. This is a great way of understanding. Books that made it into the Bible, specifically the New Testament, made it into the Bible because they were being read by communities in the early church. If texts weren't interesting or relevant, they weren't read and passed on, and they kind of faded away. So all the books we have are books that people in the early church were actually looking to and reading from and discussing. And the last criteria for inclusion into the Gospels, the New Testament, is right theology, right doctrine. So if a text or a letter or a series of writings had theology that was just not mainstream, not orthodox enough, oftentimes that book, that letter was not included. And last but not least, review from last week, there's 4 great metaphors for the Bible that are helpful to keep in mind when thinking about it yourself or talking about it with friends. The idea of the Bible as a library, collection of books, a newspaper, different types of sections in a newspaper, different type of sections and writings in the Bible, a conversation. The Bible is a conversation across the generations with us, with God. Another way of looking at the Bible is a scrapbook that people have compiled over time to tell the story of a family. All right. So this week we are looking at the question, is the Bible true? Before we answer that question, though, we need to do a little bit of history, a little bit of background. This picture here is an artist's rendering of a scene of the 30 Years' War. And I'm going to make the case today, as other scholars have, that the way we understand truth, specifically as in relation to Scripture, finds its roots in this brutal religious conflict. Much of what I'm going to share here now, I've learned from a man named David Lose, who's a great theologian in the Lutheran tradition. All right, the 30 Years' War started off as a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, but it evolved into a conflict between the Habsburg dynasty and other European powers. Brutal war took place over a 30-year period, and disillusioned by the religious fervor that fed and caused the 30 Years' War, the early architects of the Enlightenment came to believe something really important that shapes how we understand truth today. So these early architects of the Enlightenment, coming off this brutal period of conflict and bloodshed, came to believe that all claims about the natural world must be verified by the exercise of human reason rather than dogmatic pronouncement. Again, claims that are made from the natural world verified by reason, not dogma. So instead of the church being able to say something is true and therefore it's true, the Enlightenment encouraged folks to use their brains, use their resources of logic to come to conclusions. In doing so, these early architects of the Enlightenment distinguished between values, things one may believe but can't necessarily prove. And these were valuable things. These values were true and they were believable, but they weren't provable. And they distinguished that between the idea of facts, things one can and therefore should prove. Now, for these early modernists, both values and facts represented truth claims, but of a different order. So values and facts were equal and important, but not the same. But, and here's where the twist takes place in our story, over time, rationally verified facts and the scientific method to which they led became so productive and influential that it wasn't all that long until the notions of truth became associated almost exclusively with facts. So the early Enlightenment thinkers understand there are values, things one may believe but can't prove, and facts, things one can and therefore should prove. But over time, with the success of the scientific method and the growth of the Enlightenment, facts became more connected to truth than values. And this preference for facts over values created a crisis in the church. The crisis, as biblical scholars embraced the rational, critical methods of scientific, historical, and archaeological study, as they began to look towards facts as a way of proving truth, they realized that many of the facts of the Bible simply could not stand. They simply were not true in that sense of the word. The sun, as it turned out, did not revolve around the earth. The world was not created in 7 days. And not only did the Bible provide unreliable historical and scientific information, but as we discussed last week, writers often contradict each other within the biblical text. And this crisis, this realization that the facts of the Bible weren't necessarily true, drove a wedge into the church. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that wedge today. Now, the irony here, so two sides of the argument kind of took hold. This wedge created two different ways, primary ways of interpreting and understanding the scriptures. And ironically, both sides assumed that truth is equated unequivocally with facts. So on the liberal side of the divide, scholars concluded that because the Bible was not factually accurate, it was not necessarily true. This is the same argument made by some atheists today. If it's not all true, none of it is true. Now, this happens on a spectrum. Some liberal churches gave the Bible more authority than others, but a common outcome of this way of thinking is that, well, it's not factually accurate, so therefore it doesn't have much relevance to our lives today. Little trade secret here. Most pastors enjoy working in a church that's slightly more conservative than they are, in large part because in communities where folks are typically more conservative, there's an authority that rests outside the individual. Most conservatives, this is a broad term, I understand that, but most conservatives take the Bible, they give the Bible authority, more so than many progressives. And if there's a shared authority, if a document or writings are given authority in a community of faith, you can discuss that authority and disagree about it. But when the authority only comes from you and from what you individually believe, it can be really hard to create a community of faith when people are all seeing themselves as their own kind of source of authority. So that's one side of the wedge, one side of the split. And on the other side, it's the more conservative. Again, this is a general term, but conservatives asserted that the Bible was obviously true. It's a matter of faith. It's a true document. It's a gift given to us from God. So they concluded that it must also be factually accurate. And they go out of their way, typically, to make it all work, to make it all fit. One example of this is the Ark encounter outside of Cincinnati in Kentucky. $100 million was spent to build an ark to the same specifications as the ark in the Old Testament. And inside this ark, there's exhibits that go out of their way to show how history, as laid out in the Bible for 7,000 years, would actually work. So they're so committed to the Bible being all factually accurate, otherwise it's not true, that they spent $100 million to recreate an ark from a story that many people don't think actually happened to specifications given in the Bible to justify a 7,000-year timeline of human history. It's amazing how far they will go to keep the factual side of the Bible true. Otherwise, it all falls apart. That's the divide. Now, I think what this has done is, this is Morpheus from The Matrix. If you haven't watched The Matrix, in The Matrix, Morpheus gives Neo, the main character, a choice. Take the red pill or the blue pill. Take the red pill, the Matrix will fall apart and he'll see what life is really like. Take the blue pill and he'll stay in his own kind of ignorance. I think that we are given this false choice of choosing the blue pill, which is, well, Bible's not accurate, so it must not be true, or the red pill, well, the only way it is true is that it all must be accurate. And I think we need to step out of that stalemate and this false dichotomy that's been created. We need to step out of this present conservative liberal debate on how the Bible should be read and bring the Bible back to life as a relevant source by making a relevant resource, by making a different choice about how we understand it to be true. And I think there's a few principles we can kind of hang our hats on to help us not feel like we have to make a choice between it being factually accurate or just a collection of stories. All right. So principle number one, to bring the Bible back to life. Principle number one, the Gospels and all the scriptures seek to persuade and not prove. It's a great quote from David Lose I want to share. Biblical authors deployed facts not to make a logical argument, but rather to persuade their audiences of a larger truth that cannot be proved, but is finally accepted or not accepted based on its ability to offer a compelling story about the meaning and purpose of the world, God, humanity, and everything in between. So what would it look like for you to begin to see the scriptures not as a document or letters or writings out to prove the existence of God, prove historical facts, but instead as a document, as a collection of stories that's meant to persuade you to believe something compelling about God and the way God relates to the world? It's very different when you're trying to persuade someone than prove something to them. Persuasion is much more inviting. It's much more a conversation, where proving is much more of a lecture type format. I think if we can get away from the Bible trying to prove the existence of things and have it be more about persuasion, we're going to find it a much more interesting document to read and discuss. Second principle, truth is bigger than facts. Now, I'm not saying fake news here, but I'm saying that there's this concept that truth is a category unto itself that is bigger than facts. So, for example, there are many things we believe to be true that we can't support with facts, not fully anyway. I love my spouse. I love my children. I can't prove that to you. Sure, I can do things to show that love. I can be kind and gracious and run errands and clean up messes and help my kids with their homework, but that doesn't prove that I love them. They're individual acts, they're facts, but I can't tally them together and make an argument that I love them. There are things we believe that can't be proved, and that doesn't make them less true. It just makes them a different category. Post-Enlightenment, we've been stuck in this idea that we've come to believe that truth equals logically consistent plus rationally verifiable. Truth, we think, means it has to be logically consistent and rationally verifiable. And if it's not those things, it's not consistent and verifiable, it's not truth. I'm making the case that wasn't the case for the people who wrote the Bible. They did not see truth that way. The writers of the sacred texts were far more concerned about communicating the truth than they were about being factually accurate. They were not concerned about how accurate a story was as they were how what they communicated with that story. For example, Jonah and the whale. Did that happen? Probably not. But the story communicates something true. Joshua stopping the sun, the world created in 7 days. These are not factual accounts. They're stories that speak to a deeper truth. The Psalms, for example, the 23rd Psalm, that didn't happen. There wasn't a valley of a shadow of death and a shepherd walking sheep. It's a story meant to point to a larger truth about the way God is with us in difficult times. And we find comfort in that image, and that is more than okay. This is a picture, a rendition of what people think St. Augustine looked like, and he probably didn't look like this, but I love this image because he looks relieved. And I think I like this because St. Augustine, one of the great early church fathers, hardly considered a progressive, a very traditional person, he resisted being a Christian until he was taught that you didn't have to think that the Bible was literally true. So it wasn't until someone convinced him that the Bible didn't have to be literally true that he came to believe in the God of Jesus Christ. It's a fascinating thing to think about. This one of these early church fathers, what was holding him back from accepting the stories was the idea that they had to be all true. Again, truth in a different way. So, takes us to principle 3 of ways to bring the Bible back to life and get out of this false dichotomy of either or. Truth comes through story. Truth comes in and through story. What is story is the primary vehicle for truth. Now, the Old Testament is full of great stories. We know them, we teach them to our children. They're amazing. The creation stories, both of them are great stories. We teach them to our kids. They're not a scientific account of how creation was made, but they both speak to a truth about us and about God. Noah and the ark teaches us a truth about us and God, the covenant, the promise, God's frustration with humanity. All these things are true. And then come to Jesus. Matthew tells us that without a parable, without a story, Jesus told them nothing. The primary way Jesus taught his followers was through a story. And were all or any of his stories true? Was there really a prodigal son and a father? Was there really a widow looking for a coin? Are those real stories, factually accurate stories, or are they stories that he learned or created that were passed on to him that he uses to make a larger point, to persuade his listeners to accept a different way of seeing God and the world? If Jesus can make up stories to teach truth, what does that mean for us? I think it's great news for pastors who make up stories and sermons, but I think it's also empowering to us. It's interesting, I don't know about you, but when my kids are frustrated about a text in the Old Testament, something that seems too violent or too harsh, part of me wants to say, it's just a story. But I always feel bad when I tell them it's just a story. It seems to diminish the truth. But what if instead of saying, oh yeah, that's just a story about that people thought was true, what if I say, no, that's not just a story, that is a story from our sacred scriptures. And yes, we don't believe that there was a whale and Jonah was in it, but we do believe that story has something to tell us about ourselves and about God and the way God moves in the world. I think it's a freeing thing that stories are not just a story, they are a story, and stories are the primary way we receive and understand truth. All right, 4th principle. This is one of my favorite. I've been saying this for 22 years. I got this first from a book, Being Christian in the Bible Belt. It was written in the 90s. Take the Bible seriously, not literally. Karl Barth, arguably the 20th century's greatest theologian, once said, I take the Bible too seriously to read it literally. That when you take it seriously, its complexities, its power, its diversity, its intrigue, that actually gives you more to work with than if you try to read it literally and make it all fit, to make all the inconsistencies work. The mental gymnastics you spend trying to make it all factually accurate and line up is exhausting, and I think actually diminishes the witness of Scripture. Some good reasons why we shouldn't take the Bible literally, but do take it seriously. Nowhere does the Bible claim to be inerrant. There's 30,000 verses in the Bible. Not once does it make a claim of itself that it's factually accurate in terms of history and science and whatnot. The word inerrant that you'll often hear people use isn't even in the Bible. The word is not in the Bible. It wasn't even known to Christians for much of history. It was made up. The word was coined in the middle of the 19th century as a defensive countermeasure to the increased popularity of reading the Bible as one would other historical documents. So the word inerrant came up as a rebuttal to the idea that there are inaccuracies in the scriptures. I think reading the Bible literally actually distorts its witness. I think it makes it, the authors weren't trying to write a historical textbook. They were trying to confess faith, to persuade people, to recount their understanding of God's activity in their lives. I think when we try to reconcile differences between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Matthew, I think we do both Matthew and John a disservice instead of trying to understand why is John telling it that way and why is Matthew telling the story this way. Third reason, most Christians across history have not read the Bible literally. We tend to think of a label like conservative as meaning older and been around for a longer time, but early Christians and most everyone else who's lived prior to modernity simply did not imagine that for something to be true, it had to be factually accurate. That wasn't their understanding of truth. Most Christians, the majority throughout history, have had no problem with story conveying truth. That only happened after the Enlightenment. And I know people will say, well, the Enlightenment was this great moment and we learned all these things. And yes, it was amazing. I'm thankful for it. But I also think it's a bit arrogant to think that that we today, the generations that have created the atomic bomb, have 2 world wars, created the market of slavery around the world, that we think we're enlightened and have a better understanding. When in reality, these stories that have been around a long time might actually have more truth than we've gathered through our scientific method. So just a little side note there. The last principle that I want to share today is this idea of fully human and fully God. That's how we understand Jesus Christ. We understand to be fully human and fully God. We can't make sense of that. There's a mystery there, but we embrace it and believe both are true. What would it look like for us to accept that the Bible, this document, these collection of stories, these writings, this literature, was fully human, constructed by human beings with their hands over centuries, and fully God, an inspired text that can speak to us like no other text can? I love the tension that creates. I don't discount the human impact and imprint, but I also don't act like this book is just another book. The Bible, I believe, has the capacity to bring the church together, even though for much of recent history, it's been used to drive the church apart and separate communities of faith. But if we wrestle with this text, we take it seriously, not literally. We engage its stories with openness and honesty. I think we can find common ground to be together. I'm actually a big proponent of the Bible. I think it's essential for Christians to have a working knowledge of the scriptures, but I think we have to approach it entirely differently than most of us were taught to. We're not called to memorize it. We're called to live with it and engage it and struggle with it. I'm sad that hasn't happened more often in our history. All right, that's a very abbreviated version of the class on Sunday, but I hope it was helpful. Next week, we're going to look at how the Bible is the Word of God. I hope you all have a great day.